So, to simplify it, the Bank of Canada Act is a piece of legislation that's securities for Canadians. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's legislation that creates a public bank for public use by the government for its population. It's the only G8 country that actually has a public bank that's accountable to the government and created by the government. Other central banks, including the United States of America, are private banks, and that's where the problem starts. Now, since 1974, our bank has been taking marching orders from the Bank of International Settlements, which is based in Switzerland, where the private bankers make currency and fiscal policy decisions that our bank follows and adheres to, even though under statute and under our Constitution, the bank is answerable to the Minister of Finance under Section 14. And Cabinet is the ultimate decision maker on fiscal policy through the Finance Minister and the currency and whatnot. And so that bank is there for use and security for Canadians as required, as needed by the governments in executing socioeconomic planning.
So can you sum up in about 30 seconds or more what the lawsuit is specifically against who and whom?
Well, the lawsuit is against the Minister of Finance, and it's two-tier. It's a two-tier challenge. The first is to restore the Bank of Canada to one of its original and current legislative purposes, which is to provide interest-free loans for human capital infrastructure like hospitals, education, roads, and whatnot. And the second is to force the finance minister in the budgetary process, when the budget is brought down every year, to accurately and truthfully tell us how much tax was collected or collectible before they publish their net revenue. And just to explain that for a second, they only give us the aggregate amount of revenue collected after the transfer of tax credits back to corporations and taxpayers. Okay. So for instance, they say we collected $240 billion, we're spending $280, we have a deficit of $40 billion. That's not true. They collected or could collect maybe $400 billion, transfer back tax credits, and then they publish the net revenues collected. Well, that distorts the real picture, because if our parliamentarians knew how much money is collected or collectible, we could have a different view of how much tax credits we want to kick back and whether or not we need a deficit every year.
Okay, so it's basically like a false statement or a false...
It's improper accounting methods, which hides the real picture. Now, typically, our deficit every year coincides with the lion's share of interest we're paying to foreign and commercial domestic banks on our debt. Yeah. Which is bizarre, because our commercial banks get their money from the Bank of Canada right today at the lowest interest rate, which is 0.25%. They in turn often loan it back to the governments, and the government, our government, pays back commercial interest rates. So there's something wrong with this picture.
Yeah, there is. And you were saying earlier that you're trying... Currently, the Bank of Canada Act, is it active? Is it still owned by Canadians? I mean,
well, the Bank of Canada Act is still an act that's in force. Of course it's active. It's ignored by the government.
So it's ignored.
It's simply ignored. And worse than ignored, we say it's being subverted.
Subverted?
Yeah. It's being subverted by the government. And furthermore, we have a constitutional doctrine in Canada that the Parliament and the government cannot relinquish its duty to govern. That's what they're doing with respect to banking in the Bank of Canada Act. They're pretending that they are hands-off and that the government has nothing to do with fiscal policy through the bank. That's not true. Under Section 14, if there's a dispute between the governor of the Bank of Canada and the Minister of Finance, with the consent of Cabinet, the Minister of Finance can issue a directive to the governor of the bank, and he has to follow it. Because ultimately, the bank is not only created, but answerable to Parliament.
So they're answerable to Parliament.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because Canadians have always wondered whether or not they've had the authority to,
Watch your head as you come in.
Yeah, thank you.
Move to your left. That's it.
Okay. So, and my next question then is, is it safe to say under, like a legal term, that it's illegal for our Canadian government to be loaning money from a foreign institution other than ourselves?
I'd say so, because it's relinquishing sovereignty. When you relinquish sovereignty, you are abandoning your duty, both as a government and as a parliament, to to govern under the Constitution. Your only legitimacy to governing is under the Constitution. You cannot, under the Constitution, decide not to govern.
Yeah, okay, so let's